If you do anything wrong in your life, and I find out about it, I'm going to try to take everything away from you. And I don't care when I find out.
The night Will Smith walked onto that Oscar stage and slapped Chris Rock, most people assumed it would blow over in a week. A trending topic, a meme, a scandal Hollywood would quietly bury the way it buries everything else. But nearly 3 years later, something nobody expected has happened. The situation didn't blow over. It exploded. And two of the most fearless comedians alive, Katt Williams and Dave Chappelle, just made sure that it never ever will. This is the story of how one open-handed slap lit a fuse that took years to fully detonate, and how the comedians Hollywood tried to sideline became the ones holding the match. Stay with us, because by the end of this video, you will never look at Will Smith, Hollywood, or the comedy industry the same way again. The slap that cracked the foundation. Before we talk about what Katt Williams and Dave Chappelle did, we have to go back to where the story really begins. Not with the slap itself, but with what it revealed about the world that allowed it to happen. On March 27, 2022, Will Smith walked across the stage of the Dolby Theater in Hollywood and struck Chris Rock with an open hand in front of a live television audience of millions. Chris Rock, a comedian simply doing his job, had made a mild G.I. Jane reference about Jada Pinkett Smith's shaved head, a joke that took less than 5 seconds and referenced a medical condition Jada had publicly spoken about herself. The audience barely flinched. Will Smith laughed. Then something shifted. What happened next defied every unspoken rule of Hollywood, every social contract between celebrities, and every standard of public decency. Will Smith stood up. He walked onto that stage, and he hit a man who was doing nothing more than holding a microphone. The violence was real. The crack of his palm against Chris Rock's face was audible through the theater's sound system. Chris stumbled, visibly stunned, unsure for a moment whether this was a bit or a genuine assault. Within seconds, it became devastatingly clear. This was not a bit. And then, here's where it gets truly insane. Nothing happened. Security didn't intervene. The Academy didn't remove him. No one escorted Will Smith from the building. Instead, less than 40 minutes after committing assault on live television before a worldwide audience, Will Smith stood at that same podium, accepted the Academy Award for Best Actor, and received a standing ovation from the same industry that had just watched him attack one of its own. He wept. He spoke about love and God and Richard Williams. He invoked destiny. The audience clapped. Let that sink in for a moment, because that moment, that standing ovation, is what transformed a bad night into a cultural catastrophe. Not the slap, the applause. Why comedy couldn't stay silent. Comedians understood immediately what everyone else was still debating. Chris Rock had done nothing wrong. He had done his job, and he had been physically punished for it in front of the entire world, while the institution supposedly dedicated to celebrating cinema rewarded his attacker with its highest honor. The comedy community rallied. Jim Carrey appeared on CBS Mornings and called the standing ovation Hollywood gave Will Smith the most spineless moment he'd ever seen in the industry's history. He stated plainly that you do not have the right to walk onto a stage and strike someone because they said words. Bill Maher observed that alopecia is not a terminal illness and that mocking someone's appearance, especially someone who had publicly discussed the condition, does not justify violence.
How are you?
Comics across the board drew the same line. Words and violence are not equivalent. Offense and assault are not the same thing. But it was two men in particular, Dave Chappelle and later Katt Williams, who would go furthest in pulling back the curtain on what the slap truly revealed about Will Smith, about Hollywood, and about the rotting infrastructure of celebrity culture in America. Dave Chappelle, the first shot. 5 weeks after the Oscar slap, Dave Chappelle was performing at the Hollywood Bowl as part of Netflix's comedy festival when something terrifying happened. A 23-year-old man named Isaiah Lee rushed the stage armed with a replica gun fitted with a folding knife blade and tackled Chappelle to the ground in front of thousands of spectators. The attack came out of nowhere. Security intervened. Celebrity audience members, including Jamie Foxx and Busta Rhymes, helped subdue the attacker. Chappelle was shaken, but physically uninjured. Now, stop right there. Think about the sequence of events. Will Smith slaps Chris Rock on March 27th. 40 minutes later, he gets a standing ovation. 5 weeks later, someone tackles Dave Chappelle with a weapon at a comedy show. Comedy club owner Danny Zoldan, who runs Stand Up New York, put it into words that cut through every debate. Before the Will Smith incident, there was an invisible fence around comedians. People just didn't breach that fence. After the slap, she said, she predicted it would happen again, that Will Smith had broken a barrier, made violence against performers feel accessible, even acceptable. The copycat effect wasn't theoretical. It had already happened in 5 weeks. But Chappelle's response to his own attack became one of the most discussed moments in modern comedy history. Just 2 days after being tackled on stage with a weapon, he performed a secret show at the Comedy Store in Los Angeles. Chris Rock joined him. And on that stage, the two men who had both been physically attacked in the span of a month stood together and did the only thing comedians know how to do. They turned it into comedy. Chappelle joked to Chris that at least he got smacked by someone of repute. He himself had been attacked by a guy with leaves in his hair. Chris Rock's response was something else entirely. He said simply that Chappelle had been smacked by the softest person that ever rapped. The line brought the house down, but it was more than a punchline. It was a surgical strike. Chris wasn't calling Will Smith dangerous. He was calling him fake, soft, performative. A man whose tough guy moment at the Oscars was the biggest reveal of the emptiness underneath his carefully crafted image. The Fresh Prince, the blockbuster hero, the devoted family man. And in one moment of displaced rage, he had shattered it, not by being too hard, but by proving he was hollow. Chappelle's deeper diagnosis. Dave Chappelle's analysis of Will Smith didn't stop at comedy. It went somewhere far more uncomfortable and far more honest. At the joint tour Chappelle and Rock embarked on together in September 2022, beginning at Liverpool's M&S Bank Arena, Chappelle took the stage and delivered an assessment that was almost uncomfortably insightful. He said that a lot of people forget who Will Smith is, that 10 minutes before getting the biggest award of his career, Will acted like he was still back in West Philadelphia. Chappelle was pointing to something beneath the glamour. That fame doesn't change who you fundamentally are. It just gives you better lighting. Then he said this: Will did the impression of a perfect person for 30 years, and he ripped his mask off and showed us he was as ugly as the rest of us. Read that again. Chappelle wasn't condemning Will Smith. He was doing something far more complicated. He was humanizing him while holding him accountable.
People are here and screaming and cheering. People screaming your name, that makes you feel really good.
He was saying, the real Will was always in there. The rage, the dysfunction, the unresolved wounds. Hollywood let him hide it for 3 decades because it was more profitable to have America's favorite movie star stay charming. The Oscars night wasn't an aberration. It was a revelation. And then Chappelle said something that stopped the room. He hoped Will wouldn't put his mask back on. He hoped, genuinely, that Will would let his real face breathe. Here's the question you need to sit with right now. Is that compassion or condemnation? Because it's both. Chappelle was telling Will Smith, in front of thousands of people, in a moment that would be reported around the world, that everything you've built is a performance. And we can all see that now. When Chappelle released his Netflix special The Dreamer on New Year's Eve 2023, he returned to the incident again with even more detail. He revealed that he had waited after the Oscars, 30 or 40 minutes, long enough for Chris to get to another party, and then called him on FaceTime. And Chris picked up. He told Chappelle he was the only person he'd answered for. With the entire world watching and Hollywood's most powerful figures flooding his phone, Chris Rock only answered for another comedian. Someone who would understand the violation without making him a spectacle. Someone who had also felt what it was like to be attacked on a stage. Katt Williams arrives, and he brought receipts. If Dave Chappelle was a scalpel, Katt Williams arrived with a flamethrower. For years, Katt Williams had existed outside the Hollywood machine in ways that Will Smith never did. Where Will was industry royalty, box office gold, Academy approved, safe, Katt Williams built his entire career as an outsider. A man who burned bridges on purpose, who said what no one else would say, who was dismissed, written off, and dragged through tabloid humiliation for years before something extraordinary happened. In his landmark interview on Shannon Sharp's Club Shay Shay podcast, Katt Williams didn't just discuss Will Smith. He systematically dismantled the mythology of Hollywood celebrity in a way that connected directly to everything the Oscars slap had already cracked open. He named names. He provided context. He made accusations that were specific, detailed, and delivered with the calm confidence of a man who had been waiting years to be believed. But what made Katt Williams's intervention in the Will Smith saga so devastating was the way he contextualized it within a larger pattern. He wasn't just talking about one bad night. He was describing a system, a Hollywood power structure that protects certain people, silences others, and decides in advance who gets to be a star and what they have to give up in exchange for that status. And Will Smith, in Katt's telling, was not a victim of that system. He was, at various points, one of its most willing participants. The interview became one of the most watched in recent memory for a reason. Katt Williams was saying things that people had whispered about for years but could never get anyone famous enough to say publicly. He drew a direct line between the carefully managed image Will Smith had maintained for decades and the explosion that happened on that Oscar stage. The mask Chappelle had described, Katt Williams was describing how that mask gets made, who makes it, and what it costs. Here's what you need to ask yourself. If two of the most fearless, unfiltered voices in comedy are saying these things about Will Smith, one with surgical philosophical precision, one with raw documented specificity, what does it tell you about everything Will Smith spent 30 years trying to make you believe? Chris Rock, The Full Reckoning. By the time Chris Rock stepped onto the stage at Baltimore's Hippodrome Theater on March 4, 2023, for his Netflix live special Selective Outrage, the world had been waiting nearly a year for him to say something. He spent the first 50 minutes of the special not talking about Will Smith at all. He covered woke culture, the Kardashians, Meghan Markle, alopecia itself, almost as if daring the audience to wonder whether he'd even go there. And then, with 10 minutes left, he turned. He started simply. The slap still hurts. He still has Summertime ringing in his ears, a reference to Will Smith's biggest rap hit that transformed Smith's most famous artistic moment into a punchline about ongoing pain. He noted calmly and clearly that Will Smith is significantly bigger than him, that Will played Muhammad Ali in a movie, that Chris played Pookie in New Jack City and a piece of corn in a kid's film. The self-deprecation was precise. He wasn't performing victimhood. He was establishing facts. This was not a fair fight, and no one who knew the physical reality of the situation would have expected him to fight back. Then he said what everyone had been waiting to hear. He had nothing to do with the situation between Will and Jada. He didn't have any entanglements. He was referencing, of course, the infamous Red Table Talk episode where Jada Pinkett Smith had publicly discussed her relationship with singer August Alsina, a relationship she had described as an entanglement, a word that immediately entered the cultural vocabulary as shorthand for a very specific kind of public marital humiliation. Chris Rock argued plainly that Jada had hurt Will way more than Chris ever did, that everybody in the world had called Will Smith names and called Jada a predator after that Red Table Talk. And who did Will Smith choose to hit? Not August Alsina, not the internet commenters, not anyone who had actually caused him pain. He hit Chris Rock, a smaller man, a man he knew he could physically overpower, a man who, at a live internationally broadcast award ceremony, he knew would not fight back. Chris called it weak behavior, and he was right. The psychological portrait Chris Rock drew that night was devastating in its clarity. Will Smith didn't slap Chris because the G.I. Jane joke was particularly offensive. He didn't slap him because he's a fierce protector of his wife's dignity. He slapped him because he needed to perform strength he didn't feel. He had been publicly emasculated by the affair, by the entanglement confession, by a year of being called names online. He couldn't hit the internet. He couldn't hit August Alsina. So he hit the safest possible target at the highest profile possible moment, a man who wouldn't hit back in front of cameras that would broadcast his defense of Jada's honor to the entire world. It wasn't chivalry, it was theater, and Chris Rock saw through every frame of it. The invisible fence is gone. Here is something that cannot be said clearly enough. What Will Smith did on Oscar night didn't just damage one comedian, it damaged all of them. Comedy is not a casual profession. It requires vulnerability in front of strangers, the willingness to say things that might fail, might offend, might not land. Comedians operate with an unspoken social contract that has existed for as long as stand-up comedy itself. You might not like what they say, but you do not physically touch them. That's the deal. That's the fence. Will Smith knocked it down.
Yeah, you can't buy chemistry and you can't fake it. You either vibe somebody.
And he didn't do it in a back alley or in private. He did it in front of the biggest possible audience, and 40 minutes later, the very industry that should have been horrified gave him a standing ovation and the biggest award in film. What message does that send? What does that teach every unstable, aggrieved person watching from home who has been sitting in the dark, nursing a grudge against someone who made them feel small on a microphone? 5 weeks later, Dave Chappelle was tackled with a weapon. That's what the message sent. Howie Mandel said it bluntly. The slap opened the floodgates. Violence triggers violence, and venues across America had to start rethinking their security protocols in ways they had never needed to before. Barriers between audiences and performers, enhanced screening, measures that fundamentally alter the intimacy and energy of live comedy. And for what? Because one man couldn't manage his pain without using someone else's face as a punching bag. The career that was already fading. Here's the part that often gets lost in the moral debate. Before the slap, Will Smith's career had already been contracting. The era of the invincible Will Smith box office draw, the man who could open a film based on his name alone, had been quietly ending for years. Films that should have been massive swings had disappointed. The effortless charm that had made him one of the most bankable stars of his generation was not landing the same way in an era of franchises and shared universes and algorithmic streaming. He wasn't struggling, but he wasn't the certainty he once was. King Richard was supposed to be the reset, a performance-driven awards film about a black family's triumph, the kind of prestige project that reminds industry insiders what they always said about Will Smith, that underneath the blockbusters was a genuinely gifted actor who could do serious work. And it worked. He got the nomination. He was on his way to winning. And then he slapped Chris Rock and collected his trophy and gave a tearful speech about love, and the world never really looked at him the same way again. The Academy banned him for 10 years.
Opening up, and it's one of the places in the region that is, we call it film friendly.
His name was removed from consideration for multiple projects. Emancipation, the slavery drama he had filmed before the slap, and which was released later that year, was watched by audiences who, as Chris Rock noted in his special, were rooting for the wrong side. The film he made to demonstrate his range and humanity had become, through no fault of its content, a vessel for irony. He hasn't had a major theatrical success since. Katt Williams and the Bigger Picture. What Katt Williams understood, and what made his intervention so uniquely powerful, was that the Will Smith saga was not an isolated story about one man's bad night. It was a microcosm of everything broken about how Hollywood builds and destroys people. The machinery of celebrity in America requires a specific kind of compliance. It requires the creation of a persona, a mask, as Chappelle called it, that is more palatable and more profitable than the actual human being underneath. It requires PR management, image control, strategic media appearances, carefully curated emotional displays. It requires, in short, performance. Will Smith was the most perfected performer in that machinery for 30 years. The Fresh Prince persona, the action hero, the family man who was somehow both cool and safe, the rapper-turned-actor who appealed to grandmothers and teenagers simultaneously. He was the machine's greatest product, until he wasn't. And what Katt Williams had been saying for years, in the margins, in interviews that the mainstream press dismissed, in stand-up that made comfortable people deeply uncomfortable, was that the machine is corrupt, that the deals required to achieve that level of fame are not always the deals people want to talk about, that the mask comes at a price, that nobody rises that high without giving something up, usually something they can never get back. He wasn't saying this only about Will Smith. He was saying it about an entire industry, but Will Smith's very public unraveling made everything Katt had been saying suddenly, uncomfortably legible. What this means for comedy. The joint presence of Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle on stage together, refusing to disappear, refusing to stop doing edgy material, refusing to become smaller in the face of violence, sent a message that mattered. They were two of the most influential black voices in comedy, both attacked within weeks of each other, both responding not with lawsuits or press tours or tearful apologies, but with comedy, the sharpest, most honest comedy of their careers. Chris Rock turned his pain into the most watched comedy special of the year. Chappelle turned his into philosophical reflections that complicated every easy narrative about the incident.
And I would never play an arena before I saw you do it. You made me dream bigger, and you're younger than me.
Together, they demonstrated something that needed to be demonstrated. Comedians will not be silenced by violence. If anything, the violence had sharpened them. And Katt Williams, who had been circling this story from the outside for years, arrived to provide the context that neither Rock nor Chappelle were positioned to give. The industry-wide view, the structural critique, the naming of patterns that extended far beyond one slap at one award show. The three of them together form a devastating portrait of everything Hollywood had hoped to keep quiet. Will Smith's silence and what it says. In the aftermath of Chris Rock's Netflix special, sources close to Will Smith reportedly said he hadn't watched it directly, but had people tell him what was said. He was embarrassed. He was hurt. He felt Chris had crossed a line by involving Jada again. He wanted Chris to move on. He issued a YouTube apology video in July 2022 that Chris Rock publicly dismissed as a hostage video, performative contrition, calculated image rehabilitation, not genuine remorse. And then, for the most part, Will Smith went quiet.
Watching a river, or a beautiful sunset, just something natural, beautifully untouched by man.
There is something revealing in that silence. A man truly committed to accountability would have faced it publicly, would have engaged with the substance of what Chris, Chappelle, and Williams said, would have attempted to respond to the psychological portrait that had been painted of him, not to deny it, but to demonstrate growth beyond it. Instead, he went quiet and waited for the cycle to move on. But the cycle didn't move on, because comedy doesn't let things move on when they're still true. Comedy keeps poking at the wound until the wound is understood. That's its entire function. And right now, three comedians, one who was directly assaulted, one who was attacked in the aftermath, and one who has spent his career saying what no one else will say, have collectively made sure that Will Smith's moment of displaced rage is permanently attached to his legacy in ways no PR campaign can dissolve. The legacy question. Here is the question that matters most, and it's one we want you to think about seriously before you leave. What is Will Smith's legacy? Not the Fresh Prince, not Independence Day, not Ali, not King Richard, not the rap career, not the red carpets, not the decades of carefully managed American dream narrative. What is his legacy now? Because right now, in 2024 and beyond, when Will Smith's name comes up in comedy clubs, in entertainment journalism, in casual conversation, what precedes everything else is the slap, the walk across that stage, the sound of an open hand against a face at the Oscars, the standing ovation that followed, the acceptance speech delivered 40 minutes later, the mask that Chappelle described ripping off, the displaced rage that Chris Rock dissected, the structural critique that Katt Williams embedded in a larger indictment of Hollywood itself. That's the legacy. And here is the brutal final irony. Will Smith spent 30 years building an image specifically designed to outlast scandal, to survive controversy, to remain beloved through any storm. He was perhaps the most intentional architect of public persona in modern celebrity history. He understood branding before that word existed in entertainment culture. He lost it in seconds, not because of Chris Rock's joke, not because of Jada's entanglement, not because of alopecia or G.I. Jane or the 2016 Oscars boycott, but because when the pressure built high enough and the pain cut deep enough, Will Smith chose violence and then stood at a podium and asked the world to applaud him for it.
Humbled by the reaction to this film.
And three comedians, the one he hit, the one he inspired others to attack, and the one who had been warning about all of it for years, refused to let that be the end of the story. The night that changed everything. Let's be honest about something. Will Smith's career isn't technically over. He still has money. He still has connections. He still has a fan base that wants to believe in the Fresh Prince. Hollywood has rehabilitated worse, but something is over. The version of Will Smith that could walk into a room and fill it with warmth. The version whose movies you watched without thinking about what you knew. That version is gone. Dave Chappelle was right. The mask is off. And once you see what's underneath, you can't unsee it. Katt Williams made sure of that by connecting it to something larger than one bad night. Chris Rock made sure of that by dedicating the most precisely crafted 10 minutes of his career to documenting exactly what happened and why. And Dave Chappelle made sure of that by offering the philosophical framework that turned a celebrity scandal into a meditation on authenticity, fame, masculinity, and the cost of performing perfection for 30 years. One night didn't end Will Smith's career, but one night became the lens through which every year before it and every year after it gets interpreted. And that, in Hollywood, is just as permanent as an ending. Final thoughts. What do you think? Here's what we want to know from you, because this story isn't as simple as it looks from the outside and your perspective matters. Do you think Will Smith can ever truly recover from this? Not just professionally, but in the way that audiences feel about him? Is there a path back to genuine public trust, or has the mask been off too long? And what about the comedy industry? Do you think comedians today are performing with more fear than they were 3 years ago? Has the invisible fence been permanently broken, or has the pushback from comics like Rock, Chappelle, and Williams helped restore it? And perhaps most importantly, do you think Will Smith has genuinely changed, or is he, right now, working on putting the mask back on? Drop your thoughts in the comments. This conversation is far from over. If this video gave you something to think about, like it, share it, and subscribe. We are just getting started.